There's a legend in these mountains, whispered in taverns when the autumn wind howls and the fire burns low, about a woman who brought justice to Silverpine Valley. Some say it's just another tall tale born of too much whiskey and lonely nights. But those who were there, those who witnessed what happened during that blood-soaked winter of 1878, they know different. I've carried this story with me for 30 years now, tried to put it to paper more times than I can count, but somehow the words never quite capture the weight of what happened. Still, some stories demand telling, and this one more than most. If you're hearing this tale, wherever you might be, take a moment to let us know in the comments below. And if you find yourself moved by what's about to unfold, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow brings another legend from the forgotten corners of our history. Silverpine Valley wasn't much to speak of back then, just another mining settlement carved into the Montana wilderness, where the mountains pierce the sky like ancient teeth and winter holds sway 8 months of the year. The town itself stretched along the valley floor like a crooked spine, one main street lined with the usual suspects: Whitaker's general store, the assayer's office, a couple of boarding houses, and the Crown Hammer Tavern, which did more business than all the rest combined. The tavern belonged to Lily McAllister, a quiet widow who'd inherited the place when her husband Thomas passed 2 years prior. She ran it with a gentle but firm hand, the kind of place where a man could drink away his troubles without fear of getting a knife in his back. Most folks didn't pay her much mind, just another widow trying to make her way in a harsh land, keeping to herself and minding her business. Her honey-colored hair was always neatly pinned back, her clothes plain but well-kept, her manner polite but distant. Nothing about her suggested anything extraordinary. That all changed the night Marcus Kane and his wolf pack rode into town. They came with the first snow of winter, 20 hard men on harder horses, their reputation riding before them like thunder. Before a storm, the wolf pack had been cutting a bloody swathe across Montana territory, hitting banks and mines from Butte to Helena. They weren't just bandits. They were cruel men who'd developed a taste for it during the war and never lost their appetite. Kane himself was a sight to behold, tall as a pine tree, with a face like weathered granite and eyes the color of gunmetal. He wore a Confederate cavalry coat, despite the years since Appomattox, and a matched pair of Remington revolvers rode low on his hips. The war had left its mark on him, not just in the scar that split his left cheek, but in the way he carried himself, like a man who'd seen hell and decided to bring some back with him. The pack took over the Crown and Hammer that night, pushing other patrons aside, demanding service with the entitled air of men used to taking what they wanted. Lily served them without complaint, her movements measured and efficient as she delivered whiskey and beer to their tables. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. But old Jack Wheeler, who'd been tending bar for her since Thomas died, noticed something odd. The way she kept her left side away from the men, how she seemed to flow around the room like water, always aware of where everyone stood. "Mighty fine establishment you got here, widow," Kane drawled, his voice carrying over the noise of his men. He sat at the bar, watching Lily with those dead eyes. Shame to see a woman trying to run it all alone. "I manage well enough," Lily replied, her voice neutral as she wiped down the bar with smooth, practiced strokes. "We all do what we must." Kane's laugh was like rocks in a tin can. "Way I see it, a woman alone in these parts needs protection. Territory's getting dangerous. Never know what sort of trouble might ride in." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, but Lily just kept wiping the bar, her movements never faltering. "Is that so?" "Indeed it is." Kane leaned forward, his breath heavy with whiskey and malice. "Me and my boys, we might be willing to provide that protection, for a reasonable share of the profits, of course." The tavern had gone quiet, the kind of silence that falls before violence. Even Kane's men had stopped their carousing to watch. Old Jack's hand had disappeared beneath the bar, where Lily knew he kept a scattergun, but she caught his eye and gave a slight shake of her head. "That's a generous offer," Lily said, folding her cleaning rag with precise movements. "But I'm afraid I must decline. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I need to check my stores." As she turned to leave, Kane's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Wasn't really an offer, widow, more of a foregone conclusion." What happened next was so quick that those who saw it argued about the details for years after. Somehow, Lily's wrist slipped from Kane's grasp like she was made of smoke, and suddenly he was looking down the barrel of a Colt Navy revolver that had appeared in her right hand as if by magic. The gun was old, blued steel, worn silver at the edges, but it didn't waver a fraction of an inch. "I believe," Lily said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the now silent room, "you were about to remove your hand from my bar." The regulars who frequented the Crown and Hammer knew trouble was brewing thick as the storm clouds gathering over Silver Pine Valley. Word spread fast in a town that size. Within hours, everyone had heard about how the quiet widow McAllister had drawn on Marcus Kane, leader of the notorious Wolf Pack. Some folks started packing their bags that very night, knowing what usually followed when someone stood up to Kane and his boys. Others barred their doors and kept their children close, waiting for the inevitable. The Wolf Pack had taken over Mason's boarding house, their presence casting a shadow over the town darker than the mountain peaks that hemmed in the valley. They didn't leave after that first night. Instead, they settled in like a disease taking hold, spreading their influence through the town's nervous system. Each day brought new signs of their corruption taking root. First, it was the Whitakers' general store. Old man Whitaker found his delivery wagon burned one morning, the horses gone. By noon, Kane's men were offering to help with his supply runs for a reasonable fee. The assayer's office was next. Theodore Burke showed up with bruised ribs and a broken spirit, suddenly willing to verify whatever claims the Wolf Pack presented. Even Sheriff Mills, who'd kept law and order in Silver Pine Valley for 15 years, found reasons to be looking the other way whenever Kane's boys got rowdy. But the Crown and Hammer remained untouched, at least for the moment. Lily McAllister kept her doors open, serving drinks with the same quiet efficiency she always had. If she was worried about retribution, it didn't show in her steady hands or calm demeanor. The only difference was that old Jack now kept the scatter, gun on the bar instead of under it, and Lily's movements had taken on a fluid quality that some of the more observant patrons found familiar, though they couldn't quite place why. "You need to leave town, Mrs. McAllister," Sheriff Mills told her 3 days after the incident, his badge sitting as heavy on his chest as the worry in his eyes. "Kane's not the kind to forget an insult, and what you did, well, he's killed. Meant for less." "This is my home, Sheriff," Lily replied, arranging bottles on her shelf with careful precision. "Thomas and I built this place from nothing. I won't be driven from it." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creased with concern. "Thing is, Mrs. McAllister, there's rumors starting about that gun you pulled, where you handled yourself. Some folks are saying they've seen moves like that before, during the war." Lily's hand stilled for just a moment, but her voice remained steady. "Lots of rumors in a small town, Sheriff, most of them just hot air." "Maybe so," Mills agreed, though his eyes said different. "But Kane's got friends in high places. Word is he's sent for reinforcements. Rough bunch coming up from Wyoming. Territory. Man like that, he won't stop until he's made an example." Lily turned to face him fully then, and something in her eyes made the sheriff take a step back. Maybe it's time someone made an example of him instead. That evening, Margaret Wheeler, old Jack's wife who helped with the cooking, noticed something peculiar as she was bringing supplies up from the cellar. The tavern's back storeroom had been rearranged, boxes and barrels positioned to create clear lanes of fire to both doors. And in the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of flour sacks, she spotted a gun belt holding 2 more revolvers, well-oiled and ready. Kane's men returned to the Crown and Hammer that night, but not Kane himself. They were quieter than before, watching Lily with a mixture of wariness and speculation. They'd seen enough violence to recognize capability when they saw it, and something about the widow's movements kept them on edge. She served their drinks without concern, but they noticed she always kept her back to a wall, always had a clear path to the door or the bar. Rumors continued to circulate, growing with each retelling. Some said Lily McAllister wasn't her real name. Others claimed they'd heard stories about a woman during the war, one who'd ridden with a group of Union irregulars along the Kansas-Missouri border. A ghost story that made Confederate guerrillas check their backs and sleep with one eye open. You hear what they're saying about her, Ben Collins whispered to his mining partner over beers in the corner. My cousin fought with Quantrill's raiders, said there was this woman who hunted bushwhackers, called her the Widowmaker on account of how many wives she created, moved like smoke, shot like lightning. That's just talk, his partner replied, but his eyes followed Lily as she moved through the room. Ain't no way a woman like that ends up running a tavern in Silver Pine Valley. War's been over 13 years, Ben mused. Lots of folks looking to forget what they did, who they were, looking for quiet places to disappear. As if hearing their whispered conversation, Lily glanced their way. Just for a moment, the lamplight caught her face at an angle that made her look different, harder, dangerous, like a sword that had been sheathed but not forgotten. Then she smiled, soft and gentle as always, and the illusion was gone. But in the gathering dark outside, riders were approaching Silver Pine Valley. Kane's reinforcements were coming, bringing with them a storm that would turn the quiet mining town into a crucible where old ghosts would rise and long-buried secrets would claw their way into the bitter mountain air. The storm hit Silver Pine Valley like God's own fury, turning the morning sky the color of bruised lead and bringing with it 12 riders from Wyoming territory. They came through the curtain of driving snow just after dawn, their horses steam-wreathed and their long coats crusted with ice. At their head rode a man that made even Kane's hardened killers stand straighter. Colonel Isaiah Black, formerly of Mosby's Rangers, now commander of what folks along the Wyoming border called the Ghost Riders. If Marcus Kane was a predator, Isaiah Black was something altogether different. Tall and lean, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes like frozen pond water, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd never quite left the battlefield behind. 2 ivory-handled Colts rode in crossed holsters on his chest, and a Spencer carbine was slung across his back. But it wasn't his weapons that made people look away when his gaze fell on them. It was the complete absence of anything human in those pale eyes. Situation's getting complicated, Colonel, Kane reported as they gathered in the back room of Mason's boarding house. Widow's got support in town, more than she should. Black's laugh was soft as falling snow and twice as cold. A widow with a gun has you spooked, Marcus. You're losing your edge. There's something about her, Kane insisted, his face darkening. Way she moves, way she handled that Colt, professional-like. Tell me everything, Black commanded, and Kane did, laying out the events of the past few days while the colonel cleaned his pistols with methodical precision. When Kane finished, Black was silent for a long moment, his hands still on the disassembled weapon before him. Describe her again, he said finally, every detail. Honey-colored hair, usually pinned up, above average height for a woman, moves like water around rocks, carries herself straight, but loose, ready to move. Gun was a Colt Navy, well worn, but clean, drew it smooth as silk, held it like she'd been born with it. Something changed in Black's expression, a flicker of recognition that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. The tavern owner's name, McAllister, you said? Yes. Sir Lily McAllister inherited the place when her husband died 2 years back. Black reassembled his pistol with quick, precise movements, his mind clearly elsewhere. During the war, there was a Union irregular who caused us no end of trouble along the Kansas border. Elizabeth Hawkins was her real name, but we called her something else, the Widowmaker. She and her band specialized in hunting down Confederate guerrillas, particularly those who preyed on civilian populations. She was efficient. Kane's face had gone pale. I think, Black cut him off, that Elizabeth Hawkins disappeared after Appomattox. Some said she died, others that she'd headed west, but there were stories, whispers of a woman who'd show up in towns where former raiders had settled, where they thought they were safe. They'd be found later, very professionally dead. Last confirmed sighting was in Nebraska Territory, 71 or 72. If it's her, Kane started, but Black silenced him with a look. If it's her, then this situation just became much more interesting. The colonel stood, buckling on his gun belt. I think it's time I paid my respects to the widow McAllister. Lily was behind the bar when Black entered the Crown Hammer, the morning light struggling through snow-frosted windows. The tavern was empty, save for old Jack, who was stoking the fire against the bitter cold. Black moved like a ghost across the plank floor, his spurs silent, his presence filling the room like smoke. "Good morning, Colonel," Lily said without looking. Up from the glasses she was polishing. "We don't usually open until noon, but I can make an exception for such distinguished company." "Hello, Elizabeth," Black replied softly. The glass in Lily's hands didn't waver, but something in the air changed, like the moment before lightning strikes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Colonel. My name is Lily McAllister." "Is it?" Black settled onto a bar stool, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as razor wire. "Strange. You remind me very much of someone I knew during the war. She had a particular way of moving, like you do, had a talent for appearing in places where justice needed dealing. The war's been over a long time, Colonel." Lily set down the glass and finally met his gaze. "Most folks are trying to forget it." "Some things shouldn't be forgotten." Black's voice carried an edge now. "Like what your kind did to good soldiers just trying to protect their homes." "Good soldiers!" There was steel in Lily's voice now, the gentle widow's facade cracking just slightly. "Is that what you call men who burned farms and murdered families, who hanged innocent people and called it war?" "Ah," Black smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "There she is. I was wondering how long it would take to find the real you under all that respectable widow polish." The sound of Black's boots on the Crown and Hammer's wooden steps echoed through the morning air like distant gunshots. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the bitter wind. But word of the Colonel's visit to the tavern spread through Silver Pine Valley faster than any storm. By midday, even the miners up at Broken Tooth Creek had heard about the exchange between the infamous Confederate officer and the widow, who might not be just a widow after all. Lily spent the day going about her usual routine, checking inventory, preparing for the evening crowd, keeping the fires stoked against the mounting cold. But those who knew her well noticed subtle changes. The way she'd positioned the new whiskey barrels to provide cover near the stairs. How she'd moved the heavy oak table near the back door, clearing a path. Small things that spoke volumes to those who knew what to look for. Old Jack Wheeler found her in the storeroom that afternoon, carefully oiling a Winchester rifle that he'd never seen before. "You could still leave," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "Ain't nobody would think less of you for it." Lily worked. The lever action, the mechanism smooth and well-maintained. "You know why I can't do that, Jack? Because of Thomas. Because of everything." She sighted down the rifle's barrel, checking the alignment. "Because men like Black and Kane, they never stop. They find quiet places, peaceful places, and they poison them with fear and violence. They did it during the war, and they're still Doing it now. That was a different time, Jack argued, but his voice lacked conviction. Lily set down the rifle and faced him fully. Was it? Ask the Whitakers how different it feels, having their livelihood stripped away. Ask Theodore Burke how different it feels being beaten until he agrees to falsify assay reports. The uniforms are gone, Jack, but the methods haven't changed. Then why here? Jack's voice dropped lower. Why Silver Pine Valley? If you are who? They say, if you've been hunting these types, why settle in this forgotten corner of nowhere? Lily's hand went to the locket she always wore, the one containing Thomas's portrait. Because I was tired. Tired of the killing, tired of the vengeance. Thomas, he showed me there could be more to life than settling old scores. He helped me believe in something better. Her eyes grew distant. 2 years we had together, 2 years of peace, of building something honest and good. And now they're here, bringing their poison, trying to take it all away. The tavern's main room was already filling up as evening approached. Kane's men took their usual tables, but there was a new tension in their posture. They watched Lily with predatory focus, like wolves sizing up prey they weren't quite sure about. Black sat alone in the corner, seemingly absorbed in a book of poetry, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room. Margaret Wheeler came in from the kitchen, her face pale. "Riders coming," she whispered to Lily. "More of them. At least 15 from the South Trail." Lily nodded, unsurprised. "Black's been sending messages all day, calling in more of his old war companions, no doubt." She touched Margaret's arm gently. "You and Jack should take tomorrow off. Stay home." "And leave you alone?" "I'm never really alone," Lily replied, and something in her voice made Margaret shiver despite the warmth from the hearth. The new arrivals filtered in as the evening wore on. Hard men with hard eyes, some still wearing pieces of Confederate grey, worked into their trail clothes. They gathered around Black's table, speaking in low voices, casting occasional glances at the widow behind the bar. Lily served them with professional courtesy, her movements smooth and unhurried, but everyone in the room could feel the pressure building like a thunderhead about to break. "Your husband," Black said suddenly as she passed his table, his voice carrying in a momentary lull in the tavern's noise. "Thomas McAllister, tell me about him." Lily paused, her tray balanced perfectly. "What's to tell? He was a good man. He died." "Did he know?" Black's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "About your past? About the blood on your hands?" "He knew everything that mattered." "Did he know about Spencer's Ford?" The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. Lily's face didn't change, but something shifted in her stance, something subtle that made every experienced gunman in the room tense. 1864, Black continued, his voice soft but carrying. 35 men of the Missouri State Guard found dead in their camp. Very professional work. No witnesses except... He smiled, cold and sharp as a knife. Except one young lieutenant who was out on patrol, who came back to find his entire unit massacred, who spent years tracking down every rumor, every whisper about the Widowmaker. Lily set her tray down with precise care. "Sounds like a man who can't let go of the past." "The past?" Black's laugh was hollow. "The past is all we have, Elizabeth. It's what makes us who we are. Those men were under my command. They were my responsibility, and you slaughtered them in their sleep." "They weren't sleeping." Lily's voice had changed, become harder, older. "They were counting the money they'd stolen from the farms they'd burned, planning which town to raid next, how many more civilians to terrorize." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They died better than they deserved, Colonel. Better than the families they murdered." The Crown Hammer grew quieter over the next 2 days, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Regular patrons stayed away, sensing the violence brewing, like the storm that continued to heap snow in Silver Pine Valley's streets. Only Kane's men and Black's reinforcements filled the tables now, their presence heavy as lead in the air. They'd taken to calling themselves the Ghost Regiment, these collected veterans of a war that had supposedly ended 13 years ago. Lily maintained her routine, but there was no pretense now. The gentle widow's facade had worn thin, revealing glimpses of something harder beneath. She moved through the tavern like a dancer on a knife's edge, every step precise, every gesture measured. The Colt Navy revolver rode openly on her hip now, its worn grips telling tales of long use to those who knew how to read such things. "Got more coming?" old Jack reported early on the third morning, his breath frosting in the cold air as he helped. Lily checked the tavern's supplies. Spotted at least 20 riders making camp up at Carson's Meadow, Black's gathering himself quite an army. Lily nodded, checking the seal on a powder keg. "He's not just after me anymore. This is about making a statement, showing everyone what happens when someone stands against them." "Town's scared," Jack continued, his weathered face creased with worry. "Sheriff Mills resigned this morning, turned in his badge and rode out. Said he's got family in Helena. Can't blame him," Lily said softly. "Not everyone's cut out for what's coming." That's when they heard it. Horse hooves in the snow outside, then boot steps on the porch. Lily's hand dropped to her gun, but Jack shook his head. "Just Benjamin Whitaker," he said, peering through a gap in the storehouse shutters. "And he looks about ready to burst." The store owner burst into the tavern's back room, his face flushed with equal parts cold and excitement. "You need to hear this," he said without preamble. "Just overheard Kane and Black talking at Mason's. They're planning something big. Not just here. They've got men placed in 3 other mining towns up and down the valley. Once they make their example here, they're going to take control of the whole region. Already got buyers lined up for the silver claims they're planning to steal." Lily's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew colder. "How many men total?" "At least 60 by now, spread out between here and Carson's Meadow, more arriving every day. But that's not the worst part." Whitaker lowered his voice, though they were alone in the room. "They've got someone inside the territorial governor's office. Once they take control, they're going to get everything legitimized, legal papers, mining rights, everything. Just like during the war." Lily's voice was distant, remembering. "They always had friends in high places, men in clean suits who never got their hands dirty but profited from the blood and terror." "That's not all," Whitaker continued. "Black's been asking questions about Thomas, about how he died." Something dangerous flickered in Lily's eyes. "What kind of questions?" "About the mining accident, whether anyone actually saw the body after the cave-in, whether there was a proper investigation." The silence that followed was heavy as a coffin lid. Lily's hand went to the locket around her neck, her knuckles white with tension. "Ma'am," Jack said carefully, "what really happened to Thomas?" "He died in a mining accident." Lily's voice was flat. 2 years ago. Cave-in at the Bluebell mine." "Did he?" Whitaker pressed. "Because I remember something odd. You weren't surprised when it happened, almost like I was expecting it," Lily finished. She closed her eyes for a moment, shoulders straight as a cavalry trooper's. "Because I was, Thomas. He discovered something about who really owned the Bluebell mine, about money being laundered through it from other operations. He was going to report it to the territorial authorities." "Sweet Jesus," Jack breathed. "You mean—" "I tried to stop him." Lily's voice cracked slightly. "Told him it was too dangerous. That men like that, they don't let anyone threaten their operations. But Thomas, he believed in justice, in doing what was right." Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Just like I used to before the war taught me how the world really works." "They murdered him," Whitaker said softly. "Made it look like an accident." Lily nodded. "I recognized the signs. Same methods they used during the war when they wanted someone silenced quietly. By the time I figured it out, tracked down the connections. Black and his men had already moved on. I followed their trail for a while, but then, she gestured around the tavern, then I decided to wait, to build something here, something good in Thomas's memory. Fooled myself into thinking I could leave the past behind. And now the past has found you, Jack said. No, Lily's voice had gone hard as gunmetal. I think maybe I've been waiting for it. Every gun I cleaned, every drill I practiced when no one was watching. Some part of me knew this day would come, the day when justice finally caught up with the men who killed my husband. The storm outside grew stronger, wind howling through Silver Pine Valley like lost souls seeking revenge. In the distance, more riders were approaching through the swirling snow, drawn to the coming conflict like moths to a flame. The peace of the past 2 years was about to shatter like glass, and in its fragments old ghosts would rise to dance one final time. That evening, the Crown Hammer was packed with Black's men, their voices carrying over the howl of the storm. Outside, the atmosphere had shifted. Gone was the pretense of being simple travelers or prospectors. These were soldiers again, veterans gathering for a battle they'd been anticipating for years. They cleaned weapons openly at their tables, spoke in military terminology, addressed Black as Colonel with the same reverence they had during the war. Lily moved through them like a ghost, serving drinks with mechanical precision while absorbing every word, every detail. She noted who deferred to whom, which men kept their guns closer than others, who watched the doors and windows with professional awareness. Old habits died hard, and the skills that had kept her alive during the war were as sharp as ever. Tell them about Spencer's Ford, Black commanded suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise. He sat at his usual corner table, a glass of untouched whiskey before him. Tell my men what kind of enemy they're facing. Lily continued, wiping down a nearby table, her movements unhurried. Ancient history, Colonel. Best left buried with all the other war stories. Oh, I disagree. Black's smile was cruel as a winter dawn. Spencer's Ford is a fine example of your methods. 35 men, remember? Some of them boys, hardly old enough to wear the grey. You and your band tracked them for 3 days, learned their patterns, their vulnerabilities. Then, in the dead of night, they weren't innocent boys. Lily's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. They just raided 3 farming communities, killed everyone who resisted, burned every building, took everything of value, left women and children to freeze in the winter snow. They were soldiers following orders, Black countered. Fighting for their homes, their way of life. Is that what you told them? Lily turned to face him fully. When you ordered them to murder civilians, when you taught them to become bandits and murderers under the cover of war. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Hands moved closer. To weapons, bodies shifted for better firing positions, but Black just smiled, enjoying the game. And what about Thomas? He asked softly. Was that ancient history too? Did he really die in a mining accident, or did someone figure out what you really were, what you'd done? Lily's hand tightened on the rag she was holding, knuckles white with strain. You seem to know so much, Colonel. Why don't you tell me? I know the Bluebell mine was owned by some of my old associates. I know Thomas McAllister was asking dangerous questions, and I know— Black's eyes glittered with malice, that certain methods of arranging accidents were developed during the war, methods that leave no traces, no evidence of foul play. You're right, Lily's voice was deadly quiet. Those methods were developed during the war. I saw them used on farmers, on merchants, on anyone who wouldn't cooperate with your kind of justice. That's how I learned to recognize them. How I knew the moment I saw the condition of Thomas's body, exactly what had happened to him. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Even Kane, standing near the bar, looked uncomfortable, but Black seemed pleased, like a cat playing with wounded prey. So here we are. He spread his hands in a mockery of openness. The infamous Widowmaker, hiding in plain sight in a mountain tavern, serving drinks to the very men she once hunted. Tell me, Did you really think you could escape your past? Build some kind of normal life after everything you'd done? I thought I could build something good, Lily replied, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Something that would honor Thomas's memory. He believed in justice, real justice, not the kind you deal out from the barrel of a gun. And look where that got him. Black's laugh was cold as the storm outside. Dead in a mine shaft, forgotten by everyone except his murderer's widow. Lily moved so fast that half the men in the room drew their guns before realizing she hadn't gone for hers. Instead, she placed both hands flat on Black's table, leaning in close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You're wrong about one thing, Colonel." Her whisper carried the weight of 13 years of patience. "I haven't forgotten anything. Not Spencer's Ford, not the farms you burned, not the families you destroyed, and especially not Thomas. I've been waiting, watching, gathering evidence about your operations, your connections, your real business here in the territory. And soon, very soon, everyone's going to know exactly what kind of man you really are." Black's hand moved to his gun, but Lily was already stepping back, her movements liquid as mercury. The entire room held its breath, watching the deadly dance between these two relics of a war that had supposedly ended long ago. "Evidence?" Black's voice held a new edge. "You really think papers and testimonies matter out here? This isn't Kansas anymore, Elizabeth. This is the frontier. Out here, justice comes from strength, from will, from the ability to take and hold what's yours." "No," Lily's reply carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Out here, justice comes from people standing together against men like you. And you'd be surprised, Colonel, how many people in Silver Pine Valley are tired of living under the boot of killers who wrap themselves in false causes." The storm outside grew stronger, rattling the tavern's windows like angry ghosts demanding entrance. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, nature itself seeming to acknowledge the coming violence. The war that had ended at Appomattox was about to reignite in this remote valley, with stakes just as high and causes just as personal as they had been 13 years before. Morning broke over Silver Pine Valley like a bruise, the storm momentarily exhausted but threatening more fury to come. Lily stood at her second-floor window, watching Black's men moving through the grey dawn like shadows made flesh. They'd positioned themselves strategically throughout the town, on rooftops, in alleyways, anywhere that offered clear lines. Of fire to the Crown and Hammer, making quite a show of it, old Jack observed, coming to stand beside her. "Want you to see them getting ready, trying to break your nerve." "They don't understand," Lily replied, checking the loads in her Colt Navy. "For the 100th time. My nerve broke 13 years ago, watching farms burn and families die. What's left isn't nerve, it's purpose." A commotion in the street drew their attention. Theodore Burke, the assayer, was being dragged from his office by Kane's men. They threw him into the mud, scattering his papers and ledgers around him. The message was clear. Black was done playing games. "It's starting," Lily said quietly. "They're going to make examples of anyone they think might stand with me." As if to confirm her words, more of Black's men emerged from the storm's remnants, herding a group of townspeople toward the center of town. Benjamin Whitaker and his wife, both looking terrified but defiant. Mary Chen from the laundry. Even young William Foster, who'd been helping Lily with deliveries. "Time to go, Jack." Lily's voice was gentle but firm. "You and Margaret need to be far from here when this ends." The old bartender straightened his shoulders. "Known you 2 years now, watched you build this place up from nothing, seen how you treat folks fair, help them when they're down. Whatever you did during the war, whatever they say you are, to me, you're the woman who gave an old drunk a second chance when nobody else would." Lily turned to face him, emotion cracking through her carefully maintained facade. "Jack, I'm staying," he said simply. "Margaret, too, already sent word to some others. Folks who remember what it was like before Thomas died, when Silver Pine Valley was starting to become something good. Folks who've been waiting for a chance to stand up to Cain and his kind. Before Lily could respond, the morning stillness was shattered by a gunshot. They rushed to the window to see Benjamin Whitaker lying in the mud, blood spreading from his shoulder while his wife screamed. Colonel Black stood over him, gun still smoking. "Elizabeth Hawkins." Black's voice carried clearly through the cold air. "This is what happens when people stand with murderers and outlaws. Come down and face justice for your crimes, or watch everyone who helped you suffer." Lily's face went still as stone, but her eyes burned with a fire that had been banked for too long. She moved to her bed, pulling up a floorboard to reveal a hidden cache. From it she drew 2 more revolvers, these with pearl grips worn smooth by years of use. A gun belt followed, then a dark blue coat that seemed to drink in the weak morning light. "Those who know what's coming," she called out clearly, knowing Black's men would be listening. "Get off the street now." What happened next would be talked about in Silver Pine Valley for generations. Lily McAllister, or Elizabeth Hawkins, as she had once been known, seemed to flow down the Crown Hammer's stairs like water flowing over rocks. Her movements had changed completely, nothing left of the widow's gentle manner. This was the Widowmaker of Kansas, the ghost that had haunted Confederate nightmares. She emerged onto the porch just as another shot rang out. The bullet splintered wood where she had been a heartbeat before, but she was already moving, the Colt Navy seeming to materialize in her hand. Her first shot caught the rooftop sniper clean, sending him tumbling into the street. "Hold your fire," Black commanded sharply. "She's mine." He strode forward, his cavalry officers bearing proud as ever. 13 years I've waited for this. Elizabeth, 13 years tracking down every rumor, every whispered story about the Widowmaker. And here you are, hiding in a mountain tavern, playing at respectability. "I wasn't hiding." Lily's voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "I was building something good, something honest, the kind of place Thomas believed in." Her eyes hardened. "Until you and your kind brought your poison here, just like you did during the war." "Thomas." Black's laugh was cruel. "You mean the fool who thought he could expose our operation? Who didn't realize what kind of men he was dealing with until it was too late?" "You're right about one thing." Lily's gun hadn't wavered. "He didn't know what kind of men you were. He believed in justice, in doing things the right way. That's why I loved him. That's why I tried to leave the killing behind. And now—" Black's hand hovered near his gun. Now. Something terrible and beautiful blazed in Lily's eyes. "Now I remember every lesson the war taught me, about justice, about vengeance, about how some men only understand the language of violence." The street had emptied, everyone seeking cover, knowing what was coming. Only Lily and Black remained, facing each other like duelists of old, while the storm clouds gathered again overhead, nature itself holding its breath for the coming explosion. "One last chance, Elizabeth." Black's voice carried that old command tone. "Surrender. Face a proper trial for your crimes. No one else has to die here." Lily's smile was as cold as the mountain wind. "You're wrong, Colonel. Some people do have to die. The only question is how many you're willing to take with you." Snow began falling again as Lily and Black faced each other in Silver Pine Valley's main street, thick flakes swirling between them like the ghosts of their shared past. Behind Black, his men had taken positions at windows and doorways, behind water troughs and wagons, their weapons trained on the woman who had once been their most feared enemy. "You're surrounded," Black said softly, his voice carrying on the winter wind. "Even if you take me, you'll never leave this street alive." "Maybe not." Lily's reply was calm as still water. "But I stopped fearing death a long time ago, Colonel. The day I watched your men burn that first farm in Kansas. The day I realized what kind of monsters wore uniforms and called themselves soldiers." Movement caught her eye. Townspeople were appearing in doorways and windows, but not running away as she'd expected. Old Jack had emerged from the Crown and Hammer, his scattergun ready. Benjamin Whitaker, despite his wounded shoulder, had worked his way to cover behind a water trough, a rifle in his hands. Others were appearing too, armed with everything from hunting rifles to old army muskets. "Looks like you're not the only one tired of living under tyranny," Lily observed, noting how Black's confidence wavered slightly. "Seems there's still some strength left in Silver Pine Valley." "Idiots and fools," Black spat. "Playing at rebellion, without understanding the consequences." He raised his voice, addressing the armed townspeople. "This woman is a murderer, a killer who slaughtered sleeping men, who hunted down soldiers trying to protect their homes." "We know exactly what she is," Benjamin Whitaker called back, his voice strong despite his injury. "She's the woman who stood up to Cain when he tried to steal my store, who helped the Chen family when your men threatened to burn their laundry, who made the Crown and Hammer a place where ordinary folks could feel safe." "Tell them, Elizabeth," Black's voice dripped, with malice. "Tell them about Spencer's Ford, about the bodies you left behind, about the blood on your hands." "They know," Lily's reply carried clearly in the hushed street. "I've never hidden what I did during the war, Colonel. The difference is, they also know why I did it. They understand that sometimes standing against evil requires terrible choices." The tension in the street was building like pressure before a mine collapse. Black's men were shifting nervously, unsure now that they faced not just one woman, but an angry town. The snow fell harder, reducing visibility, making every shadow seem to move. "This is your last warning," Black announced, his voice carrying the authority of old battlefields. "Anyone standing with this murderer will be treated as an enemy combatant. There will be no mercy, no quarter given. Just like there was no mercy for Thomas." Lily's question cut like a knife. "No quarter for an honest man who just wanted to expose your crimes." Thomas McAllister was a fool. Black's mask of control cracked slightly. "He thought he could threaten our operations with paperwork and legal claims. Thought the law would protect him while he tried to destroy everything we'd built. He believed in justice." "Justice?" Black laughed, the sound brittle as breaking ice. "There is no justice in this world, Elizabeth. There is only power. The power to take what you want, to hold what you take, to destroy anyone who stands in your way. I thought you, of all people, would understand that by now." "I understand more than you know." Lily's voice had gone soft, dangerous as a mountain cat's footfall. "I understand that men like you never change. You just find new ways to justify your cruelty, new causes to hide behind while you prey on the weak." More townspeople were appearing now, armed and grim-faced. Mary Chen had positioned herself in the laundry's second-floor window with a shotgun. The Peterson brothers, who worked the assay office with Theodore Burke, had taken up positions behind. And their wagon, even young William Foster had found a rifle somewhere, his young face set with determination. "Look around you, Colonel." Lily gestured slightly with her free hand. "Look at what you're really facing. Not just one woman with a grudge, but an entire town that's tired of living in fear, tired of watching men like you steal and kill under the pretense of business." Black's eyes darted around the street, noting the growing number of armed citizens. His tactical mind, honed by years of warfare, was calculating odds, measuring angles of fire, assessing the changing situation. But his pride, the same pride that had driven him to hunt the Widowmaker for 13 years, wouldn't let him back down. "Even if they stand with you," his voice carried a tremor of rage now, "they can't change what you are. A killer, a murderer, a woman who abandoned her. Proper place to play at being a soldier." "You're right about one thing," Lily's reply was steady as her gun hand. "I am a killer. The war made me one. Men like you made me one. And now—" Her smile was terrible as winter lightning. "Now I'm going to use everything you taught me." Last time, the storm intensified, snow swirling between the opponents like a curtain being drawn across a stage. In windows and doorways, behind crates and wagons, The people of Silver Pine Valley tightened their grips on their weapons, ready to fight for their town, their future, their chance to break free from the shadow of fear that had haunted them for too long. Black moved like a striking snake, his first shot kicking up splinters from the Crown and Hammer's porch where Lily had been standing a heartbeat before. But she was already in motion, flowing like water between cover as more shots rang out. Her return fire was precise, economical. 2 shots that sent Black diving behind a water trough, his hat spinning away with a bullet hole through its crown. The street erupted into chaos. Black's men opened fire from their positions, but they quickly discovered they faced more than just one skilled opponent. Old Jack's scattergun roared from the tavern's doorway, forcing 3 raiders to abandon their position behind a wagon. Benjamin Whitaker, despite his wounded shoulder, proved to be a surprisingly good shot, picking off a sniper who'd been targeting Lily from the assay office roof. "Push them back," Black commanded, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Don't let her get to cover." But Lily was already moving again, her dark blue coat making her nearly invisible in the swirling snow. 2 raiders tried to flank her, only to fall to quick shots from her Colt Navy. She seemed to anticipate every move, every attack, as if she'd choreographed this dance of death years ago. "She's heading for the stable," Kane shouted, attempting to organize a response. But his words were cut short by a shotgun blast from Mary Chen's position in the laundry, forcing him and his men to scramble for better cover. The town's defenders had positioned themselves well, creating overlapping fields of fire that kept Black's forces divided and disorganized. The Peterson brothers laid down covering fire from behind their wagon, while William Foster, showing courage beyond his years, used his knowledge of the town's back alleys to harass the raiders' flanks. "This is what you trained them for." Black's voice carried across the chaos, trying to goad Lily into a mistake. "To die for your vendetta, to bleed in the snow while you play at being a soldier?" Lily's response came in the form of 2 more precisely. Placed shots that sent Black's lieutenant tumbling from his hiding place, clutching his leg. She'd worked her way to the stable now, using its multiple doors and windows to keep her opponents guessing about her position. "They're not dying for me, Colonel," she called back, her voice steady despite the exertion. "They're fighting for their town, their homes, their right to live without fear, something you never understood during the war and still don't understand now." A group of raiders tried to rush the stable's side door, thinking they'd trapped her. Instead, they ran straight into coordinated fire from multiple directions. Lily from within the stable, old Jack from the tavern, and the townspeople who'd set up firing positions in nearby buildings. 3 went down immediately, while the others fell back in disarray. "Your men aren't soldiers anymore, Colonel," Lily's voice carried clearly in a momentary lull. "They're just bullies with guns, and bullies always break when people stand up." To them, as if to prove her point, more townspeople were joining the fight. The blacksmith had brought out an old Civil War carbine, its brass fittings gleaming in the winter light. The Chinese workers from the mining camp, armed with a mix of weapons, had taken up positions that threatened the raiders' rear. Even Theodore Burke, his face still showing bruises from Kane's beating, had found the courage to join the defense. Black's carefully planned operation was unraveling. His men, used to terrorizing unarmed civilians, found themselves facing determined resistance from multiple directions. The snow worked against them now, limiting visibility, making it impossible to coordinate their movements effectively. "Fall. Back to Masons," Kane shouted, trying to rally their forces. "We need to regroup." But Lily had anticipated this move. As the raiders tried to withdraw toward the boarding house, they found their path blocked by overturned wagons and armed townspeople. The Peterson brothers had positioned themselves perfectly to catch the retreating men in a crossfire, while Mary Chen's shotgun kept them from seeking refuge in the buildings on the other side of the street. "You see, Colonel?" Lily's voice was almost gentle now, This is what happens when people stop being afraid, when they remember that men like you are just men after all. Black's response was a furious burst of gunfire at her last known position, but she had already moved again. His men were falling back in growing disorder, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. Some were already running, disappearing, into the swirling snow, leaving their wounded behind. "It's over," Lily called out, and now her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your men are breaking, the town is lost. All that's left is for you to decide how this ends." Through the curtain of snow, Black could see the truth of her words. More townspeople were emerging, armed and determined, cutting off escape routes, tightening the noose around his remaining forces. The carefully constructed intimidation that had served him so well in war and peace had shattered against something he'd never truly understood: the strength of ordinary people united against tyranny. "Never," he snarled, but there was a note of desperation in his voice now. "I didn't hunt you for 13 years to give up now. This ends only one way, Elizabeth, with one of us in the ground." The snow continued to fall, thick flakes painting the scene in shades of white and grey, while the people of Silver Pine Valley closed in around the remaining raiders, bringing with them the justice that Black and his kind had thought they could forever escape. "So be it," Lily's voice carried, a finality that made even hardened killers shiver. She emerged from the stable like a ghost from the grave, snow swirling around her dark blue coat. The Colt Navy in her hand seemed to be an extension of her will, as natural as breathing. "Let's finish what started at Spencer's Ford." Black stood in the middle of the street, his remaining men scattered and demoralized around him. Kane had taken a bullet in the shoulder and was propped against a water trough, his famous nerve finally broken. The colonel's face was a mask of fury and desperation, watching 13 years of obsession crumble like snow in spring. "You think this changes anything?" Black's voice cracked with rage. "You think playing hero to these mountain rats makes up for what you did? For the men you murdered? I've never played at anything, Colonel." Lily moved forward with the same liquid grace that had made her legend during the war. "Everything I did, every life I took, was for a purpose: to stop men like you from turning the whole world into your private hunting ground." Around them, the townspeople maintained their positions, weapons ready, but holding their fire. They understood instinctively that this final confrontation belonged to these two alone, representatives of a war that had never really ended, of wounds that had never truly healed. "Tell me something," Lily continued, her boots crunching in. "The fresh snow. When you ordered Thomas killed, did you know who I was? Or was it just business as usual, silencing another honest man who threatened your operations?" Black's laugh was hollow as a grave. "Oh, I knew. Took me a while to put it together, but I knew. The great Widowmaker, playing house with a simple... Mein surveyor, it was almost too perfect." His eyes glittered with malice. "I gave the order myself. Wanted you to feel what it was like, losing something you loved, just like you made me feel at Spencer's Ford." "Those men were murderers and thieves." Lily's voice carried the weight of old grief. "They'd lost any right to mercy the moment they chose to prey on innocent people. They were soldiers." Black's composure finally shattered completely. "My soldiers, men who trusted me to lead them, to protect them, and you butchered them like animals." "No," Lily's reply was soft but carried. "To every corner of the snow-hushed street. I hunted them like the predators they were, like I'm going to hunt every last one of you who had a hand in Thomas's death." The tension in the street was unbearable now, like the moment before lightning strikes. Black's remaining men looked at each other uncertainly, knowing they were witnessing the end of something that had begun long ago on bloody Kansas soil. "You can't kill all of us." Black's hand moved closer to his gun. "We're everywhere, in every territory, every town. Men who understand that power is the only law that matters. I don't need to kill all of you. Lily's smile was terrible as winter dawn, just enough to show others that standing up to men like you is possible, that fear only has power if people let it rule them. Old Jack's voice carried from the tavern, porch, steady and clear. That's what Thomas believed, that's what he died for. The idea that ordinary folks could build something good, something honest, if they just found the courage to stand together. Ordinary folks? Black's scorn was palpable. Look at her. Look at what she really is. A killer, a murderer, hiding behind a widow's weeds and serving drinks to better men than she'll ever be. We know exactly what she is, Benjamin Whitaker called out, his wounded shoulder not affecting the aim of his rifle. She's the woman who gave us hope, who showed us we didn't have to live in fear of men like you. The snow fell harder now, as if nature itself was trying to cleanse the violence from the air. But there would be no cleansing, no peace, until this final act played out between these two survivors of a war that had marked them both forever. Last chance, Colonel. Lily's voice was almost gentle. Surrender. Face justice for Thomas, for all the others you've killed. Die with at least a shred of honor. Black's response was a blur of movement, his gun clearing leather with the speed that had made him famous during the war. But Lily was already moving, her body flowing like water around his shot. Her own gun seemed to materialize in her hand, its report thunderous in the snow-muffled street. The colonel's first bullet threw snow up at Lily's feet. His second tore through her coat sleeve, but her shot, just one, struck with the terrible precision that had earned her the name Widowmaker. Black stood for a moment, a look of almost comical surprise on his face as he stared at the spreading red stain high on his chest. How, he managed, his gun falling from nerveless fingers, because you never understood. Lily's voice was soft with old sorrow. It was never about being faster or stronger or more willing to kill. It was about having something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. Black fell to his knees in the bloody snow, 13 years of obsession finally ending in the same violence that had defined his life. Around him, his remaining men threw down their weapons, knowing the dream of power and control had died with their leader. The winter wind carried away the last echoes of gunfire, leaving Silver Pine Valley, wrapped in a silence deep as new-fallen snow. Lily stood over Black's body, her expression unreadable as she holstered her gun. Around her, the townspeople emerged from their positions, moving to secure the surviving raiders who had thrown down their arms. "It's really over," old Jack said, softly coming to stand beside her. 13 years of running, of waiting, of building toward this moment. Lily touched the locket at her neck, the one containing Thomas's portrait. "Not running," she corrected gently. "Building. Creating something. Worth protecting. That's what Thomas taught me, that there's more to justice than vengeance." The aftermath unfolded like a spring thaw. The territorial marshals, summoned by telegraph before the final confrontation, arrived to find Silver Pine Valley citizens already organizing. The surviving raiders were locked in the jail, along with detailed evidence of their operations that Lily had meticulously gathered over 2 years. Kane, nursing his wounded shoulder, broke under questioning and revealed the names of their corrupt connections in the territorial government. But more importantly, something had changed in Silver Pine Valley. People walked taller, spoke more, freely, looked each other in the eye with newfound respect. The town that had stood together against tyranny discovered it had forged bonds stronger than any outlaw's threats. Lily continued running the Crown and Hammer, though now there was no pretense about who and what she was. The tavern became a symbol of the town's transformation, a place where honesty and courage were celebrated, where ordinary people could gather and remember how they had stood together against the darkness. "Will you stay?" old Jack asked her one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple. "Now that it's finished," Lily smiled. and for the first time in years the expression reached her eyes. Thomas believed in this place, in what it could become. He saw the good in people, saw how they could build something worthwhile if they just had the courage to stand together. She touched her locket gently. "I think I'll stay. Keep building on what he started. Keep remembering that justice isn't just about punishing the wicked. It's about protecting what's good." They say the winters in Silverpine Valley aren't quite as harsh anymore, as if the courage shown that snowy day somehow softened the mountain's edge. The Crown and Hammer still stands, its lights burning warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, when the wind dies down and the fire burns low, you might hear them tell this tale. Not just of the widow-maker who brought justice to the valley, but of ordinary people who found the strength to stand against fear and build something worth protecting. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that courage often comes from unexpected places, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Tomorrow brings another tale from the forgotten corners of our history, another reminder that the greatest legends aren't just about heroes and villains, but about the moments when ordinary people decide to stand up for what's right. Remember what happened in Silverpine Valley, where a widow who carried war's darkness within her helped a town find its light, and where justice finally caught up with those who thought themselves beyond its reach. Hit that subscribe button, and together we'll explore more stories of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of standing together against tyranny. From Shadow Creek to Silverpine Valley, there are countless tales waiting to be told. Make sure you don't miss a single one. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us tomorrow for another journey into the legends that shaped our past and still echo in our present.